says we're live. I'm going to believe that we're live, but we'll give folks a minute or two just to catch up and make sure. One thing we learned doing these programs in the spring is that technology can mess up a lot. So we'll give folks just a minute or so. I'm also going to check and make sure that we are actually live. Let's see. Yes, I see us on Facebook. All right, great. I think we're good to go then. So welcome everyone. On behalf of the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I especially want to thank the Black History Committee of the Thomas Balch Library, because this event really was your idea. You guys approached us and we thought this would be an excellent idea for a program. And tonight's program will be a centennial exploration of Loudoun County history as we look back on what Loudoun County was like in 1920. Very, very tremendous kind of watershed year in American history. Some of the issues and challenges that faced people in Loudoun are very parallel to issues and challenges we face today. You know, of course, there was a global pandemic going on in 1920. There were soldiers returning from war and trying to readjust to civilian life. There was the prohibition of alcohol, the struggle for women's suffrage, the struggle against Jim Crow and segregation. So all of these challenges are facing the people of Loudoun County 100 years ago. And to explore this time in history, we've put together a tremendous panel of historians. I'm very, very proud to know all of you and to have you here with us tonight. We have Lori Kimball, the Executive Director of the Loudoun Heritage Farm Museum, and I think Lori is going to begin our discussion tonight. So Lori, tell us a little bit about you and some of the research that you've done on this era.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. As Travis said, I'm the director of the Loudoun Heritage Farm Museum in Sterling. Prior to that, I was the director of programming and education at Oatlands. I'm also a member of the Black History Committee of the Friends of the Thomas Balch Library, and I also serve on the county's Heritage Commission. And my research is focused very specifically in Loudoun County. And some of the research that I've done in the past, and it's actually ongoing, I have been with a fellow researcher researching the people enslaved by President James Monroe here in Loudoun County, the people who were enslaved by the Carters at Oatlands. And now in my position at the Farm Museum, my interest is especially in the ownership of land and farms by African Americans after the Civil War, and learning more about what they're farming, when they purchased land and then began to sell land in the 1900s, and trying to determine why they were selling in the early 1900s. And so my focus, the research for tonight is about the pandemic in Loudoun County. But before we start there, just a little bit about where Loudoun was during that time period. So the late 1800s, Loudoun is an agricultural economy. Wheat and corn and other grains are the primary crops grown. But in the late 1800s, it starts to shift to becoming more of a dairy farming economy in Loudoun. And part of that is because of the train coming all the way out from DC, but also the growth in Washington, DC, and the demand for milk. So we start to see that increase in the late 1800s. Also during that time period, people who had been enslaved in Loudoun are starting to purchase land in the 1870s and 1880s in the predominantly Black communities of Leedsville, near Leesburg, St. Louis, and Howardsville and Willisville in Western Loudoun, and Oak Grove and Sterling were some of the communities established. And then also during that time period, large property owners, many of them enslavers during the time of slavery, started to sell their land, and people outside of the county are coming in. Charles Paxton from Pennsylvania was one of the first ones. He bought land in Leesburg and then eventually purchased about 8,700 acres, most of it all the way down the Potomac, former plantations such as Exeter and Coton. And then the equestrian community coming into Loudoun during that time period, such as Edith and William Corcoran Eustace, who bought Oatlands in 1903. They thought it was a suitable place for horses and fox hunting. So as the late 1800s, farmers clubs are being formed in Loudoun, the Aldi Club in 1871, and then Paxton and Lovettsville. And as more clubs were forming and more items being purchased, farming items purchased outside of the county, co-ops were being formed so that members of the co-ops and clubs could buy things like fertilizer and seed and so forth at a better rate than they could if they were buying individually. So for example, this year, the Maryland and Virginia Milk Producers Cooperative Association just celebrated their 100th anniversary. They were established in 1920. So by the start of World War I, dairy farming was the primary industry in Loudoun County. And according to Dr. Charles Poland in his book about Loudoun, the war elevated prices of farm products in Loudoun. So that's something that we see as a result of the war effort. For example, a bushel of wheat increased from $1 in 1917 to $2.50 in 1919. And cattle were sold for 8 and 9 cents a pound in 1917, and that had risen to 12 cents a pound by 1919. And that source came from the Lovettsville Farmers Club, another one of those clubs established in the 1800s and still in operation today. In fact, they start their meetings with reading of the minutes 100 years ago. And also mechanized farming by this time period we're talking about tonight had increased. So tractors are starting to replace horses as more efficient means of farming. One thing that the war brought about was, of course, a labor shortage. And then after the war, young men and women, but young men, both Black and white, were starting to leave Loudoun and move into the city. So that was something that we saw for better jobs and better opportunities. So that is something that we saw as a result of the war. So the lead up to 1920, obviously, the two big impacts were World War I and the pandemic, also known as the Spanish flu. And that was something, that's what led to my research of looking at the death records for Loudoun County in 1918 and 1919 was the pandemic that we're going through right now. So many an evening and weekend while we were all shut down and could not go out of the house, I started to go through the death records on Ancestry to see what I could find for the 1918 and 1919 time period for Loudoun, and that's what I'll share tonight. So I'm going to switch over to some slides. So as we're talking about the numbers, it's a little easier to see them as I'm talking about them. And so, there we go. And so one thing that, a few points to make about the methodology up front. I worked with just the death records on Ancestry, searching for records just in Loudoun County. And I categorized those records by whether the flu or influenza, depending on what the death record said, as a primary or secondary cause of death. Anything else went into the other category. But clearly, as we'll see in 1918, in the spring, as everyone is still coming to terms with the pandemic and learning about it, there were clearly deaths in the spring that probably were caused by the Spanish flu, influenza. Things like bronchial pneumonia, bronchitis. The doctors just weren't exactly sure at that point how to classify it. Not all deaths were reported. So especially in rural areas, people may not have reported the death. There might not have been a doctor. As a researcher out here in Lovettsville, where I am, found many of the families out here were much more connected to Maryland and Brunswick and Frederick. So their deaths, some are occurring there. The records there have information about deaths in Loudoun that are not evident in our death records. And then, of course, if the death had occurred outside of Loudoun, it wasn't reported here. So there are more numbers than what I'm showing you tonight, but this is a good snapshot. And as you can see here, I have the death records by month, but you can see in 1918, it very much follows what, well, sort of follows in the fall of what we're seeing today. Again, in the spring, the recordings of deaths attributed to flu, it's just not happening at that point where certainly we saw today in our present time during the pandemic, the high numbers. But what we are seeing that's similar today is the numbers really, really spiked in October. And there was one day, and I didn't write down the number for tonight's talk, but there was one day there were a number of deaths on the same date in October. It drops a little bit in November, and then it spikes up again in December on into January and February of 1919. So the total deaths, the years before it and then after, you can see the impact in 1918 of the flu. Just as if we would analyze the death records today, we would see any deaths in Loudoun caused today by the flu, those numbers spiking for this year.
Lori, I'm going to interrupt just real quick. I'm still seeing the very first slide. Are we still?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the slideshow is working. I'm still just seeing the title slide. Are you guys also seeing only the title slide?
Just the title slide.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll try to bring these numbers to life. In 1918, there were 354 deaths recorded in Loudoun County. Well, and the number from influenza was about 25% of that. There were 89 deaths, 265 not attributable to influenza. But again, that influenza number of 89 would be higher, I think, because of the deaths not reported properly in the spring. And then 17% deaths in 1919 from the flu. By district, well, if you can't see the numbers, that's a little bit difficult to understand, but in the rural areas of Jefferson District and Mount Gilead and Leesburg by far had the highest numbers you would expect because it's a denser area than Western Loudoun. By race, in 1918, out of 89 deaths, 34 categorized as Black or colored and 55 white. And similar, it's more of an equal number in 1919, where out of 49 deaths, 22 were people who were Black and 27 who were white. The one thing that I looked at was the impact on families. And if you were able to see the slide, you would see that in 1918, for example, Effie Mae Bodmer lived in Aldie, and she was 34. She was a young mother. And on December 23rd, 1918, so right before Christmas, she died of pneumonia and the flu. And then 5 days later, her one-year-old son named George also died of pneumonia and the flu. And another example, again, in December of 1918, Sadie Frances Brent was 1 year old. Her race is listed on the death record as colored. And she died on December 6, 1918 of pneumonia. Again, that's probably pneumonia and caused by the flu, sort of an interchangeable cause of death at that point. So she is age 1. And 2 days later, her 2-year-old brother Blakely died of pneumonia. And then, 3 days later, so we have the death of one child on December 6th, another on December 8th. December 11th, their father died of the flu, and he was only 34 years old. And 2 more examples of the same instances of family members dying of the flu, all within a couple days of each other. And I wish you could see this record because it is the death record for Sarah Talley of Lovettsville. And it was provided to me by Ed Spanis of the Lovettsville Historical Society. He's done a really nice article on lovettsvillehistoricalsociety.org about the pandemic's impact here in Lovettsville. But this is about another thing in common with today, the fear of getting the flu and taking unproved remedies to try to ward it off. And Sarah Talley was 59 years old, lived in Lovettsville, and her cause of death listed on the death record is overdose of oil of wintergreen. Accident was trying to prevent the flu. And so when Ed and I looked into oil of wintergreen, that was something that was being touted at the time as something that could prevent you from getting the flu. And oil of wintergreen is something in small doses that is used in items such as Vicks Vapor Rub. But unfortunately, Sally drank oil of wintergreen and drank too much of it and died from that. And so this time period that we're talking about tonight, just like we are today, clearly the pandemic of 1918 and 1919 had a big impact on the year of 1920. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Lori. Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. Yeah, unfortunately, the slide issue.
Sorry.
You know, we can't always understand what's going on with technology here, but maybe you could send those to me later and we can post the death certificate or something on the Facebook page so that people could take a look at that.
Okay.
So it's a really, really great context to what's going on in Loudoun. And I know you mentioned the impact of the war. And for a deeper dive on that, we're going to turn to James Taub here. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the research that you've done on this period.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have one picture, so you guys don't have to look at my face the whole time that you talk. And I think, Travis, I sent it to you. If you want to bring it up. But so my name is James Taub. I'm a historian, and I focus primarily on the American experience of the First World War. And I think really focusing in on Northern Virginia's experience, as well as the greater state of Virginia's experience, is a really interesting way to kind of get a general idea of what is going on in the United States in the time. And as well, although a lot of us who live in Virginia now don't necessarily think of Virginia as a deeply Southern state, it's important to remember that only about 60 years prior to the First World War was the American Civil War. The president of the United States at the time is a Virginian, though many people will say that he is the only president who was not born in the United States or did not grow up in the United States, because he grew up in the Confederate States of America. Woodrow Wilson, although he was governor of New Jersey and a history professor at Princeton before the war, was born in wartime era Virginia, grew up with much of those ideals, and goes in with sort of a Southern and Virginia sense of identity. One of the first things he does upon taking office is to desegregate, or is to resegregate, excuse me, the federal government. So there are still those lasting impacts, and those are going to drag into the First World War. The image that everybody's going to see in a bit is from a newspaper called the Richmond Planet. It's a historically African-American newspaper based out of Richmond, and it's really popular in the early 20th century. It had been started in the 1880s by ex-slaves in Richmond who wanted to get an African-American voice out there onto the street. This one is from June 21st of 1919, and it's a returning African-American soldier looking up to Virginia, which is being embodied as this sort of libertarian figure, saying, you know, all the flags and all the parades and all the ceremonies coming home is great, but how about instead we think about getting rid of Jim Crow? So there is this growing idea. Now, what is interesting, and I had mentioned to the group before, is the same day that this cartoon is published in a newspaper that had famous editorials like W.B. Du Bois and other African-American leaders at the time, there's a really horrible race riot taking place in Norfolk, Virginia on the same day. And the specific target of that race riot was returning African-American servicemen. So there is still a deep-seated racism in the United States, as well as in Virginia in particular. And it kind of sums up the African-American experience of the First World War, and as well as the American experience of the First World War. 4 million Americans are mobilized to serve in the First World War. The majority of those men are going to be men. Obviously, there's a sizable female contingent that fights in the First World War in non-combat roles, but the First World War is the first time that women are going to be part of the military. Unlike, say, in the American Revolution or in the American Civil War, where women might have joined the Red Cross or had been providing services to the military, there are women actually in uniform as part of the military during the First World War. And so in many ways, it's not a coincidence that the year after the end of the First World War, women get the right to vote. There's a strong argument that because they had taken part in the war effort, they should receive the same rights as many citizens back in the United States. Interesting as well is that of those 4 million doughboys, about 20% were not born in America. It's an army of immigrants. It's an army that represents the American society at the time. Unlike in the American Civil War, where if you had enough money, you could buy your way out of the draft. That was completely outlawed in the First World War. They wanted to have a Rockefeller serving next to a John Smith. As well, you would have soldiers not only from local areas, you of course have local Virginian units that go overseas and fight together. They're going to encourage the mixing of men from geographic areas. So for the first time, someone who grew up in a farm from Loudoun County is not going to be serving or working with every day someone else from Lovettsville or someone from Leesburg or Aldie. They might be working with someone from Seattle, Washington. They might be working with someone from Los Angeles. So for the first time, Americans of all races and all ethnicities are intermixing and socializing with each other. As well as the first time that not only wealthy Americans are going overseas, people from all backgrounds are going to go over to Europe. They're going to experience European culture, whether they be stationed in Britain, in France, or in Belgium, and they're going to get ideas of that. There's a unit that I'm absolutely fascinated by is the 318th Infantry Regiment. They're primarily draftees from Eastern Virginia, so the Piedmont, the Tidewater, and the greater Richmond area. So there are local soldiers who go overseas, and a lot of them are actually those who are listed on the Loudoun County Memorial outside the Leesburg Courthouse. One of the things that grabs me the most as a military historian, though, is they bring with them these traditional ideals of race and the place of various classes in society with them to France. And it doesn't necessarily mesh with French society. Although this is a debate and a discussion we're still having as Americans around the country today, talking about our military heroes. One of the first things that the regimental history of the 318th says when they get to France is, well, it wasn't all too different from home because we got some African Americans to offload our bags for us. So there is a deep-seated racism that's just understood. One of the issues that you'll see is that it's not before the U.S. Army shows up that African-American soldiers, serving many of them, there's about 38% of all Virginians who serve in the war are African-American. When they go overseas, they'll likely be serving in non-combat units, or they'll serve in one of the two combat divisions composed solely of African-American troops. The Army is segregated and will remain so until the Korean War. They will be not necessarily trusted to go into combat because of the racial ideas at the time. Those soldiers who do see combat are going to see combat under French command. General Pershing, who is in charge of all the Americans in France, says, well, the French and the British are asking for troops. We don't want to give away any of our troops. So I'm going to solve two problems together and send them the African Americans who we won't let fight anyway. The issue that arrives up there is these African American soldiers are going to be behind the lines in French and British controlled areas of the front. For the first time in their lives, at least soldiers from Virginia and the other states in the Deep South, they're going to be able to go to cafes that aren't segregated. They're going to be able to go to restaurants. They're going to be able to relax. And it's not till white units of the U.S. Army moved in that all of a sudden you see whites only over signs saying for cafes, for movie theaters, and other rest areas. As well, many of the officers that are going to be placed over the black troops are going to be specifically chosen as having come from a pre-war career or a pre-war family in which they managed African-American workers. So you have a embedded and you have a doctrinally approved by the American government and the American military ethos that basically says we are going to treat them in the racist and Jim Crow-esque way that they were treated at home. Otherwise, they might get too much of a sense of freedom. The African-American soldiers who are serving in France as well are going to meet people of African descent serving in the British and French imperial armies. So soldiers from Africa or soldiers from the Caribbean, which were part of the British and French Empire. While there are of course ingrained racism in both of those societies as well, it's not through law, unlike the United States. So these African American soldiers who are interacting with them are going to see that in the British Army, if you are of African descent and you have a dark color skin tone, if you were born in Britain, there's nothing that says you can't join the regular British Army. It's not going to be segregated. You're also going to see the various ideals of sort of racial equality that are starting to develop among European intellectuals become ingrained in these African American soldiers. And the big fear among white officers and among politicians back in Washington is that they're going to get these ideas. They're going to be able to, one of the worst things they think is they're going to be socializing with white women. How are we going to let them come back to the United States? So there's a deep-seated fear that these African Americans are going to have an experience that's going to make them agitate for more political and more civil liberties when they return to the United States. In a sense, that is exactly what happens. African Americans see societies where racism is ever present, but it's not bound by law. It's unlike in the United States. They're going to take many of these ideas they see, they're going to take their combat experience. For example, a famous unit is the 369th Infantry, more commonly known as the Harlem Hellfighters. And they're going to say, well, we were there, we were fighting just like in the Civil War, just like in the American Revolution. They're going to come home and say, we proved ourselves as Americans. We're going to start this fight and continue the fight for civil rights that every other American has, much as the women who were serving in the military said when they came home. So you're going to see the African American experience of the First World War being led by folks like W.B. Du Bois, really form and really become the teachers for the generation that leads the famous civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. So this is really the start. Because of this experience in the First World War, this is the start of the modern civil rights movement in the African American community. As well, African Americans aren't only going to take the ideas that they see in Europe and bring them back to the United States, they're also going to export African American ideas. One of the most interesting ones actually comes back to this 369th Infantry, the Harlem Hellfighters. Unlike every other military band that the US brought with them to France, they are a jazz band. They were formed from famous African-American musicians in New York City who traveled around the country recruiting other African-American musicians, and they formed this amazing band. And what the US officials in France recognized after the armistice in November of 1918 was the French really loved this. In fact, these guys brought the modern jazz scene to France that we still see today. And they were traveling around Europe as sort of an American goodwill mission. So African Americans are also bringing those ideals out with them. The American experience in general of the First World War is something that's really horrifying. It's our third bloodiest war. We're only actively engaged in combat really from April to November of 1918. Although the United States enters in April of 1917, it's not until about a year later that American units enter combat. The largest and bloodiest battle in American military history, still to this day, is the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. 1.5 million Americans are involved and close to 300,000 become casualties. In addition to that, you have the added deaths from the Spanish flu. So in a relatively closed period of time, you're seeing casualties that are occurring at a faster rate than they can occur in any other American war. You're going to see coming out of this specific heroes as well. Americans really love to kind of focus in on one or two people that idealize the American society. One of those is going to be Sergeant York, who's from Eastern Tennessee. But because he's a mountain guy from Eastern Tennessee, sort of proposes those Appalachian values, you're going to see a lot of the ideas surrounding his sort of soldier, his type of American return to the Virginia Piedmont and other mountainous regions throughout the American South. When these soldiers come back, black and white, they're originally greeted with these big parades. Most return in the spring and summer of 1919. However, the world quickly kind of forgets. World War I was such a horrible experience, not only for the United States, but for any country involved, that we quickly move into the Roaring 20s. There's a deep-seated need to forget, to continue to move on. It was a horrible experience. Let's not deal with that again. In Virginia, there is the added issue as well of many Confederate veterans still surviving, strong-seated Confederate associations that are still really vying for the attention given towards veterans, to the point that World War I veterans are kind of pushed aside as, oh, well, you guys went over there and fought a foreign war. You weren't fighting for defense of the state like we did. This continues up through the 1930s with the Great Depression at the beginning of the 1930s, and many of these men fighting for their benefits that have been promised to them upon enlistment. Many march on Washington as part of the famous bonus army, and they're driven off by the government. So there's also sort of a sense of betrayal of the veterans among First World War veterans. And in the South, that unfortunately means that a lot are going to turn to organizations they feel that support them, particularly the Ku Klux Klan, and among many other organizations. Others will turn to the American Legion. You'll see many American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars posts throughout Virginia that are named after soldiers from the First World War who were the first members and the organizers of these posts. So World War I has a really ever-present legacy for us here in Virginia. There's still discussion over the First World War based on the race of the soldiers as well as the experience that Virginians went through. I know now Loudoun County is talking about finally desegregating the war memorial. You can go through most war memorials, not only in the American South, but also in many northern states. And to this day, they remain segregated. And that's a wrong that is slowly starting to be righted. And I think it's really starting in Loudoun County. So there's a constant presence. As well, there's really small things that I enjoy as a historian mentioning that still affect us from the First World War. I'm originally from the Midwest, so I love to use the word buddy all the time to describe someone whose name I don't necessarily remember, but I remember they're a nice person. That's a doughboy word. From the doughboys going over, experiencing, in particular, this comes from a Welsh word, meaning I don't know who you are, but you seem nice. You'll also see various just terms. I know that we like to say, Jim, you've been talking to a while. You're kind of going over the top. Comes from the First World War experience of going over the top into the attack. So doughboy society and the First World War era remains with us to this day. It's been said that the American Revolution created the United States. The Civil War defined the United States. I think World War I defines what it means to be the modern American, because World War I set the United States up socially for what occurs throughout the rest of the 20th century, as well as debating what the American owes to the government, what the American expects from the government, what the American is willing to sacrifice, and what the American expects for that sacrifice. A lot of that comes from the first time en masse that we sent men and women overseas to fight a war, and that's the First World War. Going into 1920 in Virginia, we're seeing that returning of soldiers, that organizing of soldiers to see how can we fight for our rights as veterans through groups like the American Legion, through the Veterans of Foreign Wars. You will start to see African-American veterans organizing as well, starting that debate of we served. And we were told that if we served, we would have a foot at the table. And so they're asking for that as well. So 1920, entering the roaring 20s with the war behind us, is starting to be a time in America where people are saying, we got through the worst. This was the war to end all wars. We're not expecting any more after this. So for many people, it is a time of hope. For a lot of people, it's a time of sorrow and reflection of the suffering of the past 2 years. And for other people, it's a time to get back to work and to really show how much they had given during the war and to continue that fight for civil justice based on race or gender that is still being fought to this day. So.
Fantastic context and a really great setup for our next panel member. I'd like to introduce Marilyn Thornton, who has a deeply personal connection to a lot of the issues that you just discussed.
Yes, thank you. I am a retired college educator, and my academic fields was fine arts. But in my grandparents, Sarah and Edgar Thornton, lived in Ashburn during 100 years ago. My parents met at the Ashburn Colored School and migrated eventually to Washington. I have lived in Washington pretty much my whole life. But in I think it was 2006, I was looking through an old trunk that my father had insisted that I look through, and found a bunch of old letters tied up in a silk scarf. The letters were written between 1916 and 1924. And I discovered that my grandfather had fought in France, that he was in fact part of the legendary 369th 93rd Division, American Expeditionary Forces, all African-American regiment that fought on the front lines of France. Jim just talked about this regiment a little bit earlier. Edgar was drafted out of Ashburn in 1917 and left Ashburn. He trained in Petersburg and was sent to Camp Moret in New Jersey, sailed on a ship called the Czar. And I know this because Edgar kept his boarding card, and I found the boarding card in the trunk. It took me about 3 years to put this puzzle together, and I had to research all of the things that my grandparents wrote about in these letters. I might add that my grandmother and grandfather lived with her sister and his brother, and when Edgar was drafted, his brother was also drafted, Robert Thornton, and his brother-in-law, Albert Bushrod, was also drafted. So all of the men were drafted. Edgar had a horse. He had a shotgun. He pretty much he could use the gun because he shot rabbits for meals very often. But when he was drafted into the Army, they didn't let him ride a horse, and they didn't let him shoot. His job, I discovered after going to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and reading documents from this particular regiment. Edgar's, he was Company G, and I had all of that information. So I discovered that his job was to carry ammunition to men on the front lines. That's what Company G did, as well as maintain the supplies and things like that. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. The letters, and by the way, Jim also mentioned the Loudoun County Memorial. My grandfather's cousin, Samuel Thornton's name is on the memorial. He died in France. When I started doing research for this book, I had occasion to, because the archives is in the building just adjacent to the courthouse, and I passed the memorial and looked at it and saw the names. And I knew who Samuel Thornton was. There are only 3 African-American soldiers' names listed. The names are at the very bottom, and there's a line drawn. There's about 20 or 25 names. So I said to the person who was with me, I said, wow, you know, they segregated the names on the memorial. Well, that stayed with me for a long time because that was 100 years ago. The memorial was put up in 1922. And I think most people who passed that memorial would never even know. This is a nice memorial to soldiers who died in World War I, but they don't know, they didn't know or could not have known. In fact, a Channel 4 reporter talked with me not long ago, and she said she sees that memorial all the time and never knew the history of that. The letters that my grandparents wrote, there were 100 of them, and they wrote back and forth, and these were people back then whose education was not, this was one generation up from slavery. My grandparents were born in my great-grandparents rather, were born in 1861 and 1862. And all of you are historians, so you know that's just before the end of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. So my great-grandfather Tide had been born a slave, as well as I thought my great-grandmother was as well. But when I researched her background on Ancestry, it said FF, and I was searching for slaves, but she was a free female. So I was able to research her family from that information. Some of the letters, the writers spoke about raising farm animals, food rationing, births, deaths, illnesses, news from home, weather conditions, and financial concerns. They talked about the fact that there was a shortage of sugar. Well, we have a different kind of shortage, as you all know. I heard last week on the TV that there will be another shortage of toilet paper very shortly. So ours is perhaps a little more critical. But the Americans were sending sugar to Europe because we had all of these soldiers over there and they shipped supplies. So then the American families had to find sugar. My grandmother wrote, we can hardly get any sugar for our coffee. So that's one of the things that they were looking that affected them by this war. They also talked about the pandemic. They lived through the pandemic. They lived near Belmont and had a little farm. They raised their own chickens. They had gardens, and Sarah would can her own food. And I think that's perhaps largely why, they didn't have any need to go into the town. We now know how the pandemic, the COVID-19 is spread. And I assume that the Spanish flu was spread the same way. So they survived the pandemic, but they talked in these letters about people dying. My great-grandmother wrote, Mrs. So-and-so only lived a couple of days. They didn't know what was wrong with her, and other people dying. And like Lori, I went to the Thomas Balch Library researching this book, and they have the old newspapers on microfilm, and you can see the Loudoun Times. They actually list people who had died, just amazing numbers of people who were dying every day from the Spanish flu. And there were stay-at-home orders like we have had. Churches and schools closed, and hospitals were overwhelmed. But back then, a lot of people died at home because they didn't know what this was. And remember, they did not have the same kind of access to information and media. Some of these people didn't even have radios. So they didn't know a lot about what was going on. There has been, between that Spanish flu and this pandemic, there's been a whole century of medical and scientific progress for us, which has really largely made a huge difference. There's an old Chinese curse that says, "May you live in interesting times." Well, I think my grandparents, and I find this so incredible. I keep telling people that we're going through this now, and they went through it as well. So, and I have a direct, I can look back and see some of what happened, some of the things that happened to them. That's about it. I thought we were going to hopefully have some questions.
Yeah, that is a good reminder to the folks out there. If you do have questions, once Alicia finishes up here in a little bit, then we're going to open the floor. I'm going to ask a few questions, and if you have questions, please post them on the Facebook page, and we will try and get to all of them. Thank you, Marilyn. I love the book. I think I might have to get a copy for Jim for Christmas or something like that, because I think he'd really enjoy that perspective. But just to have that intimate family connection to the so our last speaker for the night is Alicia Cowan. Alicia, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, and good evening to everyone, and I hope my slides work. I need them.
All right, let me get that set up right down.
Okay.
I am going to.
And while you're doing that, I will tell everyone I'm also a member of the Black History Committee, Friends of the Balch Library, also a new member of the Loudoun County Historical Commission, and also a member of the Association for the Study of African Americans' Life and History. And part of this presentation is based on their 2020 theme, this poster you'll see, which is African Americans and the Vote. For the Black History Committee, I had put together an exhibit at the Thomas Balch Library in Leesburg, and I based the exhibit on African Americans and the Vote. So the ASALA, that's the abbreviation of the Association for the Study of African Americans and the Life and History and their life and history. That's the abbreviation. What I try to do is the association sets the national theme, and that I try to find items and documents that represented what was going on in Loudoun County. So I have a few of those here, which I'll show you on slides, but there were others. The exhibit was pictorial, so, and you couldn't touch anything, you couldn't pick up anything to read. So basically the slides, it's almost like looking through the exhibition at the library. So this first slide represents, as you can see at the bottom, the first group of African Americans voting after the 15th Amendment. And then there are other portions of the poster where you'll see the March on Washington. And at the top, if you look through the letters, you can see President Johnson after he signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There's Martin Luther King and Reverend Abernathy. You can see those. So it takes you from the 15th Amendment and into the 60s. But I want to pause a minute, because as I began to look at this appears to be the first time African Americans could vote, but it really isn't. Because if you go back to the founding Africans in the 17th century, say 1630, when several of the founding Africans in the English colony were freed from their servitude, if they were free and they owned land, they could vote in the colony. That changed when the founding Africans, or at least the second generation of Africans, as we moved up to 1660, and they were then deemed aliens, the vote was taken away and the English laws changed. So I say that because even I was shocked when you read about voting, you think this is the first time. No. And so therefore, in historical memory, people remembered that, yeah, we could vote. Somebody could vote. There are a few of us that could vote, although it was taken away and restored after taken away by Black laws, well, as a slave, you couldn't vote, but taken away by Black laws, and also even the 15th Amendment was taken away through Jim Crow laws and the 1902 Virginia Constitution. So I'll move to the next slide. So this shows you a registration, a voter's registration. And after the Civil War, when the United States asked the South, or required the South, to rewrite their state constitutions, Virginia wrote the Constitution such that, or the laws from the Constitution are required any registration of voters or any kind of poll tax list that they be separate. So you had a colored list and you had a white list. This is a copy of an original 1888 voter registration list, which is housed in the Thomas Balch Library. And you can touch it and feel it. If you're like a history geek like me and you want to touch things, you can actually touch it. You don't have to put gloves on or anything, not at this point. This was the colored roll for citizens at that time. And it's good if you are third, well, fourth, fifth, sixth generation from Loudoun, you might find a family name on this. That's why it's so important. And you can see that your ancestor registered to vote. Now, I don't know if they voted because the Thomas Balch Library only has this registration. And I'm finding through my experience that these are located all across the county. In fact, there's some in the courthouse. Some of you mentioned Ed Spanis. They just discovered some out in Lovettsville. And for those of you who are part of the Piedmont area, Karen White down in Forkyard has a bunch of them, which she's analyzing right now. So I got real excited. I'm looking for as many as I can. I won't be doing as much analytical work as Karen White is doing, but I find it extremely exciting to look at the family names from this county. So I'll take the next slide. This shows you after Reconstruction. These were men throughout Virginia who actually in 1887 and 1888 were part of the General Assembly. They weren't very long because the laws were quickly changing. There were laws to disenfranchise Blacks as soon as they voted. The white power structure and various organizations, the Democrats, were hard at work trying to see how they could disenfranchise Black men based on the 15th Amendment and poor white men, especially those who did not own property. So there was a lot going on at that time. It requires a lot of study, but it's very interesting. Where I have the little blue tab was William H. Ashe. He was actually born in Loudoun County. He did not go to the General Assembly for our county. He really went for Nottoway. And, but after, of course, they were voted out. When I say voted out, because after that, you had limited voting by Black men. So they had no constituency. So they did not go back to the General Assembly. And he came back to Loudoun County and actually taught in Loudoun County for many years. So he was born in Loudoun and he spent the rest of his life in Loudoun County. So we take him as our own. Okay, next slide. So we were talking about World War I, and these were actually some of the soldiers from World War I. We have a picture of them standing in front of the courthouse, but of course, because they were, quote, colored, their picture was taken after the white soldiers. So you'll find that not only was there segregation, but it was almost like no matter what you did, you still went to the back of the bus. So even in taking pictures, they couldn't take a picture first. They had to take a picture second. And as you can look at them, how young they look. Primarily, they were in the Army and the Navy. Again, as Jim talked about, there were non-combat positions such as cooks, stevedores, transportation people, but they wanted to serve just like their ancestors before them who served in the Civil War and those who served in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1807. It's amazing how these young men wanted to participate in the American way. They wanted to be patriots. They wanted to be full citizens. And so one way of being a full citizen is to prove to everybody that you can fight. But I must say, and I'm not a military historian, but one thing I did notice is that they were disarmed from the very beginning of fighting. So back to the Civil War, there were laws that people of African descent could not bear arms, take it forward, skip over a couple of wars, but they didn't get arms. Take them to World War I, no guns. There was this constant fear that if a Black soldier was skilled in shooting or using firearms, they would come back and possibly shoot white citizens. So that was always a fear. If you read anything, even if you're not a military historian, you read anything, that's the first thing they do. No guns and separation. So this was very typical of World War I. But many of these, although I'm sorry we don't have names, but many of the Loudoun soldiers who served came back and worked in their communities. So even though they couldn't vote, or if they could pay the poll tax or pass the literacy test, they were determined to do it because all of voting and being in the military was part of being a patriotic citizen. Now they are maybe maybe 2 generations from slavery, but they've now been in this country for like 100 years. So they don't know any other place. In fact, they have probably never seen Africa on the map. This is the home that they know, so they want to fight for this home. Jim did mention that when they were in Europe, they met people from especially North Africa for the first time, and they saw brown-skinned people. There are some interesting stories. I think I heard them out of the World War I Museum, and how the interaction, the Africans didn't know how to respond to them, and they didn't know how to respond to the Africans. And of course, most of the Africans spoke French and other languages. So here they're looking at people who have skin tones the same as theirs, but they don't have the communication to really get to know each other. So I really found that was fascinating. Okay, next slide, please. This is the monument that Marilyn and Jim were talking about. It is out in front of the courthouse. I think it's on Market Street, faces Market Street. And I will go to the next slide and I'll talk more specifically about it. So I'm bringing this up because even though we're talking about the vote, but the vote was one of the main things that many of these soldiers wanted to do when they got back home. We're looking at this monument. This is the brass plate. If you look down at the bottom near the tip of the sword, you'll see the line that separates the colored soldiers. And we had Johnson Thornton, which Marilyn found out is her relative, and Gilbert, and they were all privates. Now, this just means that these are the ones who died and were recognized or died back here in Loudoun County. It doesn't mean that these were the only people in the World War I. A lot of World War I soldiers sometimes never came back to segregated communities. They became part of the migration to the north so they didn't come back all the time. And of course, many of them died in Europe, and some stayed in Europe. But I will tell you the update on this memorial. Marilyn, in case you hadn't heard, that the Board of Supervisors voted to have this changed and corrected, I guess I'll say, to have a correct history. And what is the name of the post? The Army post, James, what are the names of those groups? The Veterans of the Foreign Wars.
Veterans of Foreign Wars and the American Legion.
Thank you. And so they're going to help to correct this, and they'll be working on it between now and next year, 2021. There's a fund that allows that to happen that the Board of Supervisors administers. So I think that'll be really exciting, because we're in a period where we're able to now correct some of these monuments and correct American history. Not to erase, but to tell the truth. Next slide, please. So this is, again, a poster created for the Association for the Study of African Americans Life and History. And it represents a look at the 19th Amendment, the suffragettes, the women. And as you can see, it goes over time. Typically at the bottom, these are famous women that you know: Claretta Scott King, Sojourner Truth. I'm sorry about the middle one. I always forget about her. Maybe I'll think of her before we're finished. In the middle where it says African Americans and the Vote, you'll see students who who protested for the right to vote. And at the top, all the women in Black, and I'm not sure, this was all over the blogosphere, all over the internet. These were women in 2019, they were judges who were elected throughout the state of Texas. And they all took a picture together. And there are like 13 of them or something like that, but they were elected as judges in Texas. A little bit like, I'm not sure if you saw pictures of the female soldiers, the female cadets at the military college in New York. That's the Army. What's that called?
West Point.
West Point, the West Point Academy.
Yeah.
And those women were graduating, I think it was 2018 or 2019, and they created a picture of about 20 of them that were graduating in that class, and it went all over the internet. And then you see women at the top who were suffragettes in their communities. Now, while we're talking about this, it would looking at the trying to research women in Loudoun County in terms of voting, we'll have to go back to what Lori was talking about, that the environment here was rural, agricultural. Most of the suffragettes in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, even up to 1920, this was really reserved for upper middle class white women. A few African Americans who I would say were graduates of universities or high schools, formed their clubs, but they were not accepted in many of the national white suffragette clubs. They were not accepted. So they formed their own. They realized that a few could participate, but in general, white women didn't feel that Black women were of the same status. Also, they did it in the advocacy for the right of women to vote. They did not want to upset white Southern women. So the way to do that is you don't want to sit in the same part of the bus. So they could not participate in the clubs. So they started their own. And so what you see today, and I know there's some questions related to this later, but what you see today also is partly the fact that historically there has been a separation. There has been a coming together and there has been a separation, but eventually there was the ratification of the women's vote in 1920. However, Black women had to take the back seat due to Jim Crow. Black women were still denied the vote based on the laws of the 1902 convention. That wouldn't get thrown out for some time, but they still struggled on. Some of these women had already been abolitionists, so they were already in a fight. Some of them were already, like Sojourner Truth at the bottom. She was already fighting for men for the 15th Amendment. So some of this started way back. And eventually the fight has just gone on. So we'll move to the next slide. And what I will show you on this is that it is a registration form for voters in Jefferson District. And it was October 1920. If you look on the right-hand side, you will see colored. Well, now you will see that everyone is included. The people who are colored, they will put in paren next to it. Of course, they did that not just on the voting laws, but also all the soldiers. When you research them, they will have colored, or they will have on their draft card a snip on the corner. And the snip on the corner means that the person is, quote, colored or Negro, whatever it was the census definition at the time. And so you will see on this particular registration form, if you look at number 15, you'll see Serena R. Collins. So for those Collins families in Loudoun County, this was one of the first females to register to vote. And you will also see, of course, above Serena Walter Moore, a male, and then you come down, you'll see other males. But based on many of the laws, when African Americans were coming out of the Civil War into Reconstruction after the 15th Amendment, men voted, and this is not, I'm just using this just based on my survey, but not a scientific a number. But Black males probably voted 60%. This is how all those Black men went to the General Assembly. But after 1902, and they changed the laws to limit and added suppressive means like poll tax, literacy test, it dropped from, say, 60% to 10%, which meant at that level, you're not going to send anybody back to the General Assembly. And anytime you vote, your vote really isn't going to count, but it's a good idea to keep voting because it's being a good citizen, and maybe your children will be able to send someone to the General Assembly. So you do see people who do continue to vote. Okay, I'll go to the next slide. This was a real Marie Moton Medley Howard. You can see she was born in 1900. So she was really in between she was a child and, well, she was a young woman in 1920, and then fully matured during the Voters' Right Act in 1965. But she was a firebrand here in Loudoun County. And born in Leesburg, she was the first president of the NAACP. She was encouraged to start the NAACP by Charles Houston, the famous attorney who came to Loudoun County and the first African-American to practice in the courthouse. There's a lot of history behind her, but she straddled the time period of the 19th Amendment. And I'm sorry I never got a chance to meet her, but the good thing about it is we were able to capture her in one of our Black history books so that those of us who are not able to meet her and talk with her have a chance to find out what she was all about. Okay. This now takes us up to 1965. And before I forget, because it slips my mind, I just saw it yesterday. During this period in 1967, there were some of the first African-American men who were elected for their local council. And one of them was in Middleburg, and I'm sorry, it escapes. Might be Purcellville was the second location. But prior to that, there had not been, and I hope that as I look over the documentation and the research in this area, that I'll come up with other people. But this poster represents the 1965 Voter Rights Act. And of course, it puts some of the very famous people who were advocates for that. You'll see the picture of Shirley Chisholm in the middle, and she was the first woman to be nominated by a major party to run for president. She was not nominated, but she ran on the Democratic Party. At the very top on the right-hand corner was Angela Davis, and some of you are familiar with her. If not, please Google her. She is still teaching out in California, and from time to time, if you're interested, you can go on C-SPAN or you can Google her for YouTube. She speaks all the time. And of course, Martin Luther King, who was there with President Johnson. And let me know my time, somebody. Okay, I think I'm okay. And then again, the March on Washington. There's one famous woman that, not necessarily from Loudoun, but some of you probably have heard of Fannie Lou Hamer. She was a real firebrand, because she was not coming from, in the 1950s and the 40s, from the area of middle-class women. She was a working woman. And she's the one that said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I love that because we can use that a lot of times when it comes to voting and our political situations. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And if anybody says that, make sure that they give Fannie Lou Hamer credit for that, because she had a very hard and difficult life. But she believed in democracy, and she believed that she should be able to vote. And she came up in the very harsh Jim Crow in Mississippi. And she would be able to appreciate what we're talking about tonight. So I'll go to the next. These are our youth. This was in the early 1970s. And these were young people who were registering to vote in Leesburg. So here, after the 1965 Voter Rights Act, the participation of African Americans in the right to vote just skyrocketed. And you could see the difference throughout the United States as well as Virginia and slowly here in Loudoun County. Okay, next.
So Alicia, I think
Out
we're
of
gonna we have to wrap it up, and so we have a little bit of time for questions here. 'Cause
Okay.
we've got a lot of questions.
Can I just show that last newspaper?
This one here?
Yes,
Okay.
because this was just January 2019, and this shows you how far we have come. In the middle, from right to left, you'll see Karan Sands, and he was the new vice chair for the Board of Supervisors. At the bottom, we have two South Asians on the left for the board, school board. On the right is a new delegate for the General Assembly of Virginia. And of course, throughout the paper, you'll see Chair Randall and Sylvia Glass, who is a new supervisor. So this just shows you from beginning up until January how far Loudoun County has come. And so with that, I'll close out.
All right. Great. Well, like I said, we've had a lot of wonderful questions come in. A lot of them actually about voting. So our good friend Allison Herring is asking, what voter registrations for African Americans exist at the Balch Library? Or are there any at the Library of Virginia?
I'm sorry, just repeat that first. What
voter registrations for African Americans exist at the Balch?
Okay, they're not really the archives for voter registration. What I showed is just something that was given to them, and they keep in their special collection. So what I showed you is basically what I know that they have, but I did send an email. I have not heard from Eric yet, Eric Lawson at the courthouse. And I know he has a few. So unfortunately, they're scattered. As I mentioned, in Lovettsville, it's Spanish. Ed has some in his museum, which he discovered just recently looking for other information. So it's, and I don't know what the laws are for gathering that information and having it in one place. But I think you could start at the library, and then the Lovettsville Museum would love to have you come and look at what they have. In Forkier, even though it's not Loudoun, but in Forkier, Karen down at her museum, she would love to have you. So until there is some county effort to pull them all together and maybe digitize them. Maybe we'll throw that out somewhere. I don't know.
Another question about voting, Lynn is asking, where did Black voters vote? Were the polling places segregated?
That's a good question. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that. I suspect that they may have, I'm just suspecting, they probably have the same place. The Black people had to stand in a different line and had to wait until all the white people went first. I'm just conjecturing on that. Historically, not today, of course, not today, but historically. And of course, that photo I showed you was as you can see, those young people were all registering in Leesburg. It was probably the county election office. But that was in the 70s, and I have a feeling the person is talking about prior 1965. Do you know anything, Lori? Nothing, nada. Okay, but it's a good question.
It's a good question. Yeah,
Yes.
something I'd never thought of before.
Yes, me either. Mhm.
So this is a question from Marilyn. Donna wants to know, did Samuel Thornton live in Ashburn as well?
I'm not sure. Samuel was my grandfather's cousin, and he still has, there are direct descendants that live in Leesburg now. So I can probably find out, but I'm not sure where, where he lived. There is, and I need to talk with my cousin Alice, because there are 2 death records for Samuel. One death record has him buried in France, and there is another death record that shows later on that he's buried in the States. So I'm still doing research, and I'm not really clear where he's interred.
Just another, I guess, comment for you. Gertrude mentioned that her uncle, Wade Hampton Moore, served in World War I. He was from Middleburg, and he's actually mentioned in your book. I guess he would have known your grandfather. So
yes, when I spoke at the Balch Library, I think it was 2016, and there were so many letters from people mentioned in my grandparents' letters. So in the back of the book I have, and this is the book, I will send a copy to you, Jim, because I have extras. But so many people who were mentioned in these letters, and I did a thorough indexing in the back. And when I spoke, there were people who came to the Balch Library simply because they knew their family history and bought books. I was lucky enough to have them purchase books to read these letters, and have since that time talked with so many people and heard really wonderful stories about their histories. And that's one of the good things that came out of this. But I will send you a copy of this, Jim.
Can't wait.
So this is a good question, kind of building off of that from Laura, saying, we know that women are serving in the military in World War I. You mentioned that that's the first war that women are actually an active part of the military. Are women of color serving in the military at this time, or is it just men?
Yeah, so there are African American women who are serving in the military. Predominantly, you see them again in sort of these rear line areas. I can't remember their names, but I will send this to you, Travis, for you to post on there. Probably the most famous group of women that come out of military service or near frontline service during the First World War are actually not members of the military, but they're the closest American women to the front lines, and they're the Salvation Army donut dollies. The Salvation Army donut dollies, as Mike suggests, are there to give the soldiers hot coffee and donuts. And they also popularized the donut in the United States. So when anybody goes to Dunkin' Donuts, you can thank the World War I generation for making that a thing. Part of that, it originally started as a, just a nice thing, but it was quickly picked up on actually in the medical field as a way to combat what at the time they called battle fatigue. So to have a bunch of restless nights and wet and cold conditions and have someone with a smiling face give you a cup of coffee and a donut, they noticed it actively helped. And these women, you see them in photos up near the front, you see them with gas masks and helmets, so they're within the range of being hurt. And African-American women are present in the Salvation Army donut dollies. You do see, although the units are segregated, you do see mixed groups of Salvation Army women, both white and African-American. Traditionally, the Salvation Army would be assigned to each division of the U.S. Army. So you could be a Salvation Army woman from Richmond, and you would be assigned to the 80th Division, which are a bunch of guys from Virginia. And that goes as well with African American women. She would likely be assigned to an area where the African American men are serving at the front. So you do see them there. You see them with other various religious sort of support organization. Again, the Salvation Army is a great example of that. There are other organizations for Catholic Americans. There's a Knight of Columbus. And as well, you see a lot of African Americans volunteering as nurses and medical personnel with the American Red Cross, as well as the U.S. Army Medical Service. There's also a group of African Americans who serve with the larger American group of women in the Navy in what are called the yeomanettes. Obviously, there's a rank in the Navy called yeoman, and the yeomanettes were a nickname given for yeomen, and in parentheses, you see F, which stands for female. They prefer just to say yeomanettes, and they were doing a lot of the logistical and administrative work for the Navy during the First World War, and you see lots of African-American women serving with that as well. And the requirements to enter them, where you had to have a high words per minute on typewriters to enter, which I think is fascinating. But yeah, so it does exist. And Travis, I will send you, there's some amazing photos of African-American women right up at the front lines, assisting in administrative efforts. And they're all available through the National Archives. So.
Great. I'm looking forward to, I'll be happy to share that with you guys at the Black History Committee. Another question from Allison. Lori, do you plan to publish any of your research on the pandemic in Loudoun?
Possibly, and I know Ed Spanis is listening, and working with Ed on some more information about Lovettsville. But yes, there is a publication called The Bulletin that's being published by Diversity Fairs. It used to be published by the Loudoun Historical Society, and it's an article that we may work on for next year. And somewhere I have all of the records transcribed into an Excel spreadsheet for both years. So obviously that's not going to go in that book. So I'll find some other way of sharing that spreadsheet.
Great.
What's interesting, what I found in there, which might be helpful for people, is that a number of records, especially for babies, refer to burials in the garden or at home. And so, that was a time where, especially in rural areas, people were not necessarily being buried in public cemeteries or church cemeteries. So, it's interesting the number of burials, including adults, that did take place at home.
Yeah, interesting that you brought that up. It reminds me of a story that Jennifer Moore, the president of VPHA, told me a while back, that as a young lady, she was up on some family property outside of Stumptown Road, so up near Luckett's, and out in the woods there was supposedly a burial yard, like a small family burial plot from the pandemic, and that there were maybe 4 or 5 bodies out there. We'll have to get together with Jennifer and see if we can learn a little bit more about that, but it's exactly like what you just mentioned, that they're burying people at home or in the garden. So just a reminder, anyone watching on Facebook, if you have questions, go ahead and enter them in. Anne-Marie is working diligently behind the scenes to text me any questions you guys have. But in the meantime, I had a few questions to get the discussion going here. One that Anne-Marie came up with earlier is that, World War I changed the world, it changed the country. And on a local level is what we've talked about tonight. It really changed Loudoun in a lot of ways, and in a lot of ways set up what we see happening in 1920. Do you think those changes would have happened without the war? These broader social movements that are happening, would they have happened by 1920 without the war?
I would say, on a broader sort of American point of view, I think they likely would have, but it's an unfortunate fact that war speeds up technology. In many ways, the U.S. economy recovered from the Great Depression by the materiel effort that FDR boosted, which led, as we were prepping to enter the Second World War. So I think that in many ways it does. I think I think that as well, back to that point I made earlier, it really helps in many ways to bring at least the white American community sort of back and continue to mend the wounds of the Civil War. Again, this is only 1 or 2 generations away for many people, and it also brings, as I hinted at before, it brings America and American institutions under the eye of the world like never before, to the point that foreigners are going to comment and compare and contrast, much like Americans compare and contrast. It is almost ubiquitous that in accounts from Allied soldiers, primarily Canadian, French, British soldiers during the First World War, who come across an American area of the Western Front, they comment on how the Americans treat African American soldiers. Although they're not coming from, the most accepting societies as well, it gets to the point that they comment on it and they're taken quite aback by it. So it is in many ways, I think it was inevitable that the country, advanced in the way it did, but it always takes these sort of tumultuous and events to kind of push it along in many senses. And I think the First World War did that in many ways, much like the Civil War did, much like the Second World War did.
Marilyn, in reading your grandfather's letters and your family letters, is there a sense of that? Are there letters from France where Edgar is talking about, does he comment on the different perceptions of Black troops over there versus back here in Virginia?
No, the letters were censured, all of them. And you can actually see the signature of the person who censured the letters as they were going back and forward. Their family was primarily, and it took a long time for the mail to get from one place to the next. These letters, the reason when I first found them, why I thought they were such an interesting and valuable collection was because my grandmother saved her letters, obviously. Edgar brought his letters home with him, and his sister-in-law apparently gave, Sarah's sister apparently gave her letters to Sarah. So there were connections. You could see what one person had written and you could see a response, even though the response and initial letter were dated. They did not talk a lot about, Edgar didn't talk a lot about, or at all, about how he was treated. His sister, Maud, wrote, he had the mumps, and they were worried about him because he was in the hospital. And Maud wrote, she wanted to know if people were mean to him. And I think that was her language for, are people being nice to you? Are people being, really terrible to you? And he said no. In fact, when he was in training camp, they very rarely spoke about, Black and white. But Edgar did say, he was in training camp, that one of the white boys asked him about the box that he had given, because it had a lot of really good stuff in there. And he said they asked him if that was his box, because people would send packages to soldiers. And so he was communicating with white soldiers in training camp, but he did not talk a lot about how they were treated. Very interesting, because somebody asked me the same, people have asked me the same question on several occasions, but they were primarily very worried about what was going on at home, how they were surviving. These were not people who had a lot of resources. As I said, they were one generation up from slavery. Edgar was a farmer. He eventually went to work for the railroad. And but in answer to your question, no, I did not find correspondence that related anything like that at all.
So we have another question from one of our viewers, wanting to know, are there voter records from every county in Virginia, and are they segregated?
I'm not an expert in that area, but I will say that there would have to be. And of course, they were segregated up to a certain point because they were by law. In other words, as I had mentioned, in the 1880s, you had to have a completely separate book. So for men, it was colored men and white men. I don't know in Virginia if we had Asians at that time, I'm not sure. So I'm just looking at black, white. Then after a certain point, definitely in the 1920s, you could include everyone on the same page, male and female, but you identified the colored or another race, you identified it. So I would suspect that went all the way up to 1965, because almost everything that revolves around voting has been like pulling teeth. I mean, you think that everybody has the right to vote, and then you find out the states have the right to determine who has the right to vote, how they can vote, when they can vote, and taking it up to 2020, you can see that. You can see that there are, I think, 5,000 counties, and each county has its own rules and regulations. So in Virginia, how many counties do we have? 63, I think, or something like that. And within our own region, Loudoun County, Fairfax County, Culpeper, all the laws are all different. So people are treated differently. You may even have to decide what county you want to move to based on how you might be treated, or if you can vote. So another point of research, we need some PhDs here.
So another question, and this can go to the entire panel. We can kind of go around the room. What is your biggest challenge when it comes to researching this period? What's the biggest challenge you've come across in doing your research, Lori?
Not so much related to the pandemic. And of course, with the repositories closed while I was doing this, there was, that challenge. But in some other research projects for that time period, just finding local newspapers that still existed, that still existed or have been scanned. Win Saffer has, many of you know Win Saffer, who's a researcher and historian in the county, has a theory that because of the quality of newspapers from that time period, some did not survive very well, and that's why they don't exist to be scanned. And the other, it's interesting, I thought that there would be more information just in general available, but for whatever reason hasn't been captured. I'm talking locally.
How about for you, Marilyn? Was there any particular challenge in putting together the book?
Well, it took about 4 years to research all the different things that I wanted to research for this book. The letters initially, because they're written by people who didn't have formal educations, I had to pretty much translate the letters. They were written in pencil on in some cases, the Army had admonished its soldiers to write on both sides of the paper, and I had to try to duplicate and translate those letters. So that was the big challenge initially. Coming to Loudoun County meant I had to drive and go to all the different places. It's how I met Lori, by the way, trying to trying to find out all the different things about the people. And when I was invited to speak at the Balch Library in 2016, I think it was 2 years ago, on the anniversary of World War I had to hurry up and get finished. So I just stopped doing everything because I would have gone on and on. So, and then I had to get the publication process completed. But the challenge was, well, it was daunting. It was also really wonderful because I loved what I was doing, and having met all of these people during the process who, descendants of some of these people who were mentioned in the book, was just wonderful.
Any particular challenges that you faced in your research, Alicia? Uh-oh, she's muted. Hold on a sec. Alicia, you muted yourself.
Okay,
There we go.
here I am. We had a little technical difficulty over here with the battery. I had to get my husband to go and get the cord. So that probably muted me. But getting back to challenges related to the vote, I guess goes back to the question that someone asked, are the voting registrations, is the information all located in the same place? Of course, I thought it would be, and then I found out no, and that might be from a certain period up to maybe the 1960s. I haven't really talked to anyone about it, so it may be historically. So that's a good question, and that is a problem if you're going to research that far back. And that would be one thing, would be documentation centrally located. And then the stories about voting experiences in Loudoun County. Now, the Balch Library has, I'm not sorry, not the Balch, but the Black History Committee has done a number of oral narratives, but you have to ask the question, that question may not have been in there. So we don't necessarily have a record. I know Lori's done a lot of things, and then there's there are other groups have done narratives. There might be out in Lovettsville. I think there is a woman, Bernadette, I can't think of her full name, so excuse me, but she's doing research on her grandfather or great-grandfather, because she found his name on one of the voter registration lists. So she's done a lot of deep dive, and she and Ed have worked together on that. In fact, I think they did part 1, part 2 in their newsletter. So there you have a more recent documentation of a story, which the ancestors dug up. But I would say part of the impediment to that, finding information, is we have to realize that, number one, historical societies for African Americans in most locations are very recent. We're only, many of us, not all of us, I don't want to say all of us, but many people are only 3 generations from reading and writing. And what I was going to go back and add for the military, what did they bring back, or how did the war, I don't know the word help, but what was the impact? The impact is education isn't just reading and writing, but knowing people around the world, knowing that there's possibilities. And that's what a lot of those soldiers brought back. When they had an opportunity to compare with the rest of the world, come back. And if you read the documents, the literature, the books about African Americans in Loudoun County, 90% of it is about schools, creating schools. getting land for which they struggled. I mean, I grew up in Washington, D.C., so I didn't know the struggle that people had in southern towns just to get an acre of land to build schools. So a lot of the foundation of the descendants of today in Loudoun County has been getting that education, so when they have an opportunity to vote, they can read it, they can write their name. And until they can do that, the possibilities, opportunities are limited.
Fantastic point. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. All right. Very quickly, Jim, how about you? What challenges do you face when you're working on this kind of research?
A lot. As someone who's vying for trying to get funding for a PhD on America and World War I right now. History, I'll say that it doesn't matter what time period or what topic you study, history is really struggling right now for money, as are all of the humanities, and for the attention they deserve. And I think if a lot more people were forced to take a lot of history classes, we might not have the same problems we have right now. But it is really interesting studying the World War I era in America in general. And this is not something specific to Loudoun County, Virginia. It's a real American issue. I think that where World War I falls in the timeline of American history, with the Civil War being the major event and Reconstruction being the major events right before it, and the Second World War being the event right after it, it kind of gets sandwiched out. World War I also does not, and the era around it does not have a traditional, I'm going to put this in, quotation marks, happy ending. The war to end all wars ends up leading to another war. As well, there's no clear cut, hey, the Union stays together, the slaves are now free. There's no, we defeated a horrible dictator, and there's going to be hopefully peace in Europe from now on out and in the Pacific. World War I at a base level does not seem to accomplish much. It ends up leading to conflicts not only that we are involved in, but many nations are involved in. Part of the reason we're still involved in the Middle East is the Sykes-Picot Treaty, which divided up and created countries out of nowhere. So, I think that's one of the major issues as well, especially in this area. You can't, like the rest of us, I'm in Arlington now. I don't think I could get on my roof and throw a baseball without hitting a Civil War battlefield. And part of that is I'm obsessed with the time period as well. And the history of where the men fought and suffered is over in France. And it's not until you get to sites like the Loudoun War Memorial or really start to connect with these people that at various graveyards. I know I've taken Travis all over Northern Virginia saying, hey, here's a World War I vet. So it is much harder to really kind of make that personal connection to show people why World War I is important in the time period around it. So that's something, and to get students educated. If I wanted to get a class from Arlington to learn about the Civil War and the time period around it, I could hop on a bus, head over to Oatlands, and talk about the experience of enslaved people in Northern Virginia. If I wanted to talk about the Fiscal War, I could get them on a bus, drive up to Gettysburg or down to Bull Run. I can't get kids to France easily. So that's another one of the major issues. And so it's a constant struggle really to say, hey, World War I is really important. We should all learn a little bit more about it. It's also greater to say, hey guys, and this is something everybody on this chat and a lot of people watching will know, it's really hard now to get people to say, hey, history is really important. We should pay attention to it. So that's kind of the big struggle.
Well, I'm going to make one last check to see if we have any more questions. I don't have any more from Anne Marie. So, guys, thank you so much for spending the evening with me tonight. This was a wonderful discussion. A lot of fascinating research going on out there. I know our audience really enjoyed it, and I just want to thank you all for bringing your expertise tonight.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
No problem.
All right.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
So from the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area, thank you all who are watching at home. thank you for joining us. Keep an eye out for more great online programming as we kind of head back into winter. We're going to switch back to mostly digital programming. If you're interested in what we have coming up, you can follow us on Facebook. You can go to piedmontheritage.org and sign up for our weekly newsletter, which will give you an idea of what's coming along. So again, thank you all for joining us.
Good night.
Good night.